The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of downtown as Robert Chen stepped out of his Tesla Model X, designer shoes clicking against the pavement. At 45, he had everything money could buy: 3 luxury hotels, a real estate empire worth billions, and a social media following that hung on his every word. But today, something different caught his eye. There, huddled in the doorway of his newest property development, was a woman wrapped in a weathered blanket. Her belongings fit into a single backpack, but even in her current state, there was something about her that made him pause. Maybe it was the way she held herself, or how she'd carefully arranged her few possessions. Whatever it was, it gave him an idea. "Hey, Frank," he called his friend on video chat while walking into his office. "Remember how you said my social media stunts were getting boring? Well, I just had the most brilliant idea." He settled into his leather chair, spinning to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he practically owned. Frank's laughter crackled through the phone. "Another publicity stunt? What now? Going to buy another island?" "Better." Robert's lips curled into a smile. "I'm going to marry a homeless woman." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds before Frank burst out laughing. "You're joking, right?" "Dead serious. Think about it. Rich businessman marries homeless woman. The headlines write themselves. We'll make it a 6-month contract, splash it all over social media. My followers will go crazy." As Robert explained his plan, more friends joined the video call. Some thought he'd lost his mind. Others called him a genius. None of them considered the woman's feelings. She was just another prop in their world of endless entertainment. Later that afternoon, Robert walked back to the doorway where he'd seen her. She was still there, reading a worn paperback book she'd carefully covered in plastic to protect it from the elements. Her name was Angela, he learned, as he approached her with his practiced camera-ready smile. "I have a business proposition for you," he said, standing over her with his perfectly tailored suit casting a shadow across her face. "How would you like to make $100,000? Angela looked up, her dark eyes showing neither excitement nor fear, just careful consideration. She marked her page with a scrap of paper before closing her book. "I'm listening," she said, her voice clearer and steadier than he expected. Robert laid out his plan like any other business deal: 6 months of marriage, social media appearances, living in his penthouse. He'd pay her $100,000 when it was over, and she'd sign an NDA about the arrangement. "Think of it as a job," he explained, already imagining the viral videos they'd make. What he didn't expect was her response. "Before I answer," Angela said, slowly standing up to face him, "I have one condition." She stood straight despite her worn clothes, looking directly into his eyes. "During these 6 months, you treat me with basic human respect. No mockery, no humiliation. I may be homeless, but I'm not your puppet." Something in her tone made Robert pause. This wasn't going according to his script. Homeless people weren't supposed to negotiate terms. They weren't supposed to speak with such dignity. But it made for an even better story, didn't it? The homeless woman with standards. His followers would love this twist. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. As she shook it, he noticed her grip was firm, her hands surprisingly clean. He pushed away the nagging feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. After all, this was just another business deal, another social media stunt. 6 months would fly by, his follower count would explode, and they'd both get what they wanted. Little did Robert know, as he led Angela to his car to discuss the contract details, that this simple publicity stunt would unravel everything he thought he knew about success, worth, and humanity. But that realization was still to come. For now, he was simply pleased with himself for coming up with his most outrageous stunt yet. The next morning, Angela walked into Robert's downtown office building wearing the same worn clothes from yesterday. The security guard gave her a suspicious look, but Robert's assistant was already waiting in the lobby to escort her up. As they rode the elevator to the 50th floor, Angela caught her reflection in the polished doors. She looked out of place in this temple of wealth, but her eyes held steady determination. "The contract is straightforward," Robert said once they were seated in his office. He slid the thick document across his mahogany desk. 6 months of marriage, public appearances, social media content. You'll live in my penthouse, attend events with me, and play the part of the grateful homeless woman given a second chance. He smirked, clearly pleased with himself. And at the end, you get $100,000. Angela picked up the contract, her fingers tracing over the legal language with unexpected familiarity. "May I have a moment to review this?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of something that made Robert's assistant look up from her tablet with curiosity. "Take your time," Robert replied, barely hiding his amusement. He turned to answer some emails, expecting her to just sign it blindly. After all, what homeless person would actually read a legal contract? But Angela did read it, carefully and methodically. After 20 minutes, she looked up. "There are a few points we need to discuss," she said, pulling a pen from her backpack. "First, the social media clause needs clarification. I won't participate in anything deliberately humiliating." Robert's fingers stopped typing. He turned away from his computer screen, truly looking at her for the first time. "Excuse me." "And the living arrangements section," she continued, turning to page 4. "It states I'm restricted to certain areas of the penthouse. That won't work. If I'm playing the role of your wife, even temporarily, I need to be able to move freely in what's supposed to be my home." The assistant tried to hide a smile as Robert struggled to maintain his composure. This wasn't how he expected the meeting to go. "Also," Angela added, making neat notes in the margin, "the clothing allowance should be specified. If you want me to attend high society events, I'll need appropriate attire. That should be separate from the final payment." Robert leaned back in his chair, a mix of irritation and intrigue crossing his face. "You seem quite comfortable with contracts for someone who—" He paused, realizing how his words might sound. "For someone who sleeps in doorways." Angela finished his sentence, her voice calm but firm. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Chen. But that doesn't mean I've lost my ability to understand a legal document." The assistant coughed quietly, hiding what might have been a laugh. Robert shot her a look, and she quickly excused herself from the room. "Fine," he said after a moment. "We can make those adjustments. But remember who's doing who a favor here." Angela placed the contract back on his desk. "Are we? You need someone to play this role for your social media stunt. I need a chance to rebuild my life. Seems like a fair exchange to me." For a brief moment, Robert felt unsettled. This woman didn't act like any homeless person he'd ever met. She spoke with confidence, read contracts like a lawyer, and negotiated like a businesswoman. But he pushed these thoughts aside. This would just make their story more interesting for his followers. "I'll have the contract revised," he said. "Come back tomorrow morning." Angela stood up, gathering her worn backpack. "One more thing," she said at the door. "When you post about this on social media, remember that I'm a human being, not a prop for your entertainment." As she left, Robert stared at the marked-up contract. He'd expected this to be simple. Find a desperate homeless woman, make her sign the contract, create viral content. Instead, he found himself dealing with someone who seemed to see right through his game. What he didn't realize was that his perfect publicity stunt was about to become something far more complicated than he'd bargained for. Angela had just shown her first cards, but she was holding a full hand that would soon turn his world upside down. The wedding was nothing like Angela had imagined as a little girl. Instead of a heartfelt ceremony, it was a carefully orchestrated media event at Robert's newest luxury hotel. Camera flashes lit up the marble-floored ballroom as reporters jostled for position, all eager to capture the heartwarming story of a billionaire marrying a homeless woman. "This is what true charity looks like," Robert announced to the crowd, his arm wrapped around Angela's waist. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, chosen by Robert's PR team for maximum impact. Everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. The headlines started rolling in immediately. Billionaire's beautiful act of kindness, from doorway to penthouse. A modern Cinderella story. Real estate mogul proves love knows no bounds. Robert's social media followers doubled, then tripled. His posts about their story went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times. But it was Angela who truly captured people's attention during interviews. When a popular morning show host asked how it felt to suddenly have access to such luxury, her response left the host speechless. "Wealth is temporary," Angela said, her voice steady and thoughtful. "I've learned that firsthand. What matters is how we treat each other, regardless of our current circumstances." She paused, looking directly into the camera. "Everyone sleeping rough has a story. Mine isn't more important just because someone with money noticed me." Robert nearly choked on his coffee watching the interview from his office. This wasn't the grateful, starstruck response he expected. His phone buzzed with a message from his friend Frank. "Dude, your homeless wife sounds like a philosophy professor." The media circus grew more intense as people became fascinated by Angela's mysterious past. She handled each interview with unexpected grace, never playing into the rags to riches narrative Robert's PR team tried to push. Instead, she turned conversations toward homeless advocacy and the importance of seeing people's humanity. "Your wife's quite the natural at this," commented Lisa, Robert's PR manager, watching Angela charm yet another interviewer. "Where did she learn to handle the media so well?" Robert shrugged, but the question nagged at him. He'd noticed other things too. The way Angela easily navigated high society events, how she could discuss art and literature with his wealthy friends, her perfect table manners at fancy restaurants. She was playing her part flawlessly, too flawlessly. One evening, at a charity gala, Robert overheard two of his business associates whispering. "There's something familiar about her," one said. "I swear I've seen her somewhere before, years ago." Before he could hear more, Angela appeared at his side. "Your friends seem quite interested in my past," she said quietly, sipping champagne with perfect poise. "Can you blame them?" Robert replied, studying her face. "You're not exactly what anyone expected." Angela smiled mysteriously. "Maybe it's time to question those expectations." She nodded toward a group of photographers. "Shall we give them what they want?" The happy couple, spreading joy on social media. Robert posed with her for photos, but his mind was racing. In just 3 weeks, his simple publicity stunt had spun far beyond his control. His social media following was exploding, yes, but something felt off. Every time he thought he had Angela figured out, she would say or do something that hinted at a deeper story. That night, as they returned to the penthouse they now shared, Robert watched Angela walk confidently through his home, their home, technically. She transformed from the woman in the doorway into someone who moved through high society as if she'd been born to it. And maybe, he was beginning to suspect, she had been. As Angela bid him good night and retired to her separate bedroom, Robert pulled out his phone and started searching. Something about the way his business associate had recognized her bothered him. Who was this woman really? Little did he know, the answer would shake the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. 1 month into their arranged marriage, Robert couldn't ignore the oddities anymore. He stood in the penthouse doorway, watching Angela reading a medical journal in the living room. She transformed his cold, showroom-perfect space into something that actually felt like a home. Fresh flowers appeared regularly on the dining table, and the kitchen now smelled of home-cooked meals instead of takeout. "Would you like some tea?" she asked without looking up from her reading. "I just made some mint and chamomile blend." "Since when do we have tea?" Robert asked, walking into the kitchen. He found not just tea, but an organized pantry with herbs and spices he couldn't even pronounce. Since I reorganized the kitchen last week, she replied, joining him. She moved through the space with familiar ease, reaching for cups and saucers that matched perfectly. Your kitchen was sadly underused. Robert watched her precise movements as she poured the tea. You know, most people who've been homeless for years don't know how to properly serve tea in fine bone china. Angela's hand paused briefly. Most people who've been homeless haven't had my life experience, she said simply, handing him a cup. Before he could question her further, his phone buzzed. His assistant was reminding him about tomorrow's charity dinner, an annual event where his company donated to the local hospitals. You should come, he found himself saying. It's usually quite boring, but... A hospital charity dinner? I'd love to, Angela replied, a bit too quickly. Something flickered in her eyes. Eagerness? Nostalgia? The next evening, Robert understood why she'd been so interested. Angela wasn't just comfortable at the event. She was in her element. When the hospital's chief of medicine gave a speech about new surgical techniques, she nodded along, understanding every word. During dinner, she discussed recent medical breakthroughs with the doctor seated next to her, using terminology that made Robert's head spin. How do you know all this? He finally asked as they rode the elevator back up to their penthouse that night. I read a lot, she said vaguely. The library was always a good place to stay warm. But Robert wasn't buying it anymore. Earlier that evening, he'd noticed how several older doctors had done double takes when they saw her, as if trying to place a familiar face. One had even started to approach her before being pulled away by a colleague. Back in the penthouse, he watched as she kicked off her heels, designer shoes she wore as naturally as if she'd worn them all her life. She moved the baby grand piano in the corner, the one that had been purely decorative until she arrived. Her fingers ghosted over the keys. Do you play? He asked, though he already knew the answer. He'd heard her playing when she thought he wasn't home. Complex classical pieces that no self-taught pianist could master. A little, she said, but her fingers betrayed her, automatically finding their positions for what he recognized as a Beethoven sonata. You know what's strange? Robert said, loosening his tie. I've been looking through social media posts about us. Thousands of comments about the homeless woman who married a millionaire. But not one person has come forward claiming to know you from the streets. No homeless shelter workers, no other people who lived rough. It's like you just appeared one day in that doorway. Angela's hands stilled on the piano keys. For a moment, the penthouse was completely silent. Perhaps, she said finally, that's because you've been looking in the wrong places. She stood up, smoothing her evening gown. Good night, Robert. Thank you for taking me to the dinner. It was enlightening. She walked to her room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Robert pulled out his phone and opened a search engine. This time, he wasn't going to look for information of homeless communities. No, he had a different idea. He typed in, Female Doctors Boston Hospitals Last 5 Years. As the results began loading, he had no idea that he was about to uncover a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about his pretend wife and himself. Robert couldn't tear his eyes away from his computer screen. After hours of searching, there she was, Angela Peterson, head of neurosurgery at Boston General Hospital. The photo was 3 years old, but the woman in the white coat, holding an award for medical excellence, was unmistakably his pretend wife. He scrolled through article after article. Dr. Peterson pioneers revolutionary brain surgery technique. Rising star in neurosurgery saves child's life with innovative procedure. Boston's brightest. Dr. Peterson nominated for Harper Medical Excellence Award. Then suddenly, the article stopped. He found a small piece buried in the local news. Renowned surgeon's husband dies in tragic accident. The story was brief. A rainy night, a slippery road, a head-on collision. Angela had been working late at the hospital. Her husband had been driving to pick her up. The next morning, Robert watched Angela making breakfast in their kitchen with new eyes. She moved with the same precise movements he'd seen in videos of her performing surgery. How had he not noticed before? "We need to talk," he said, placing his laptop on the kitchen counter. Angela glanced at the screen and froze. Her hand, reaching for a coffee mug, trembled slightly. "Ah," she said quietly. "I wondered when you'd find out." "Why didn't you tell me?" Robert demanded. "You're not just some homeless woman. You're Dr. Angela Peterson. You were one of the top neurosurgeons in the country." Angela set down the coffee pot carefully. "Was I? That feels like another lifetime ago." She sat down at the kitchen island, suddenly looking tired. "After David died, I couldn't perform surgery anymore. My hands would shake every time I picked up a scalpel. I kept seeing his face, thinking about how I should have left work earlier that night." Robert sat beside her, his publicity stunt forgotten. "But how did you end up on the streets?" "Depression is a powerful thing," she said, staring into her coffee. "I took a leave of absence. Started missing mortgage payments. Couldn't face going back to the hospital where every corridor held memories. When you're spiraling down, each day makes the next one harder." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "It's surprisingly easy to go from having everything to having nothing." Robert thought about all the times he paraded her in front of cameras, treating her story like entertainment. Shame crept up his neck. "The medical journal you were reading the other day," he said. "You weren't just reading it." "I never stopped learning," she replied. "Even on the streets, I'd sneak into hospital libraries. Medical science doesn't stand still just because your life falls apart." A thought struck him. "At the charity dinner, those doctors who recognized you." "Former colleagues," she nodded. "I saw the panic in their eyes. Nobody wants to acknowledge how thin the line is between success and rock bottom. It makes them uncomfortable." Robert ran his hands through his hair. "I've been such a fool. Using you for social media fame when you're probably smarter and more accomplished than everyone at my dinner parties combined." "You're not the first person to underestimate someone who's homeless," Angela said gently. "But maybe you can be one of the few who learns from it." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. "You know what's ironic? This whole arrangement. It gave me what I really needed. A fixed address. Stability. The chance to slowly find my footing again." She turned back to him. "My medical license is still valid. I just needed to prove I was stable enough to practice again." Robert stared at her in amazement. While he'd been playing social media games, she'd been quietly rebuilding her life. His publicity stunt had turned into something far more meaningful than he'd ever imagined. "What happens now?" he asked. Angela smiled, and for the first time, he saw the confident surgeon she must have been. Now we decide if this marriage becomes more than just a contract. But first, I need to share something with you of the hospital charity dinner tomorrow night." The annual hospital charity gala buzzed with excitement. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as Boston's elite mingled in their finest attire. But tonight was different from all the previous galas Robert had attended. Tonight, he walked in with Angela on his arm, knowing exactly who she was. Dr. Peterson. A silver-haired doctor nearly dropped his champagne glass. "Is it really you?" Before Angela could respond, they were surrounded by her former colleagues. The chief of surgery pushed through the crowd, tears in his eyes. "We thought we'd lost you," he said, pulling Angela into a hug. "When you disappeared after David's accident." Robert watched in amazement as doctor after doctor came forward. These weren't just colleagues, they were people whose lives Angela had touched deeply. A young neurosurgeon spoke about how Angela had mentored her. Another recalled a particularly difficult surgery where Angela's innovative technique had saved a child's life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the hospital director announced from the podium, "tonight holds a special surprise. One of our most brilliant surgeons has returned to us." He gestured toward Angela. "Dr. Peterson, Would you please join me on stage? As Angela walked up, Robert saw her not as his pretend wife or the homeless woman from his doorway, but as the accomplished doctor she truly was. The audience fell silent. 3 years ago, Angela began, her voice steady, I lost my way. Not just my husband, but my purpose, my identity, my hope. She paused, looking out at the crowd. I ended up on the streets, where I learned that a person's worth isn't measured by their address or bank account. It's measured by their humanity. The room was completely still. Even the servers had stopped to listen. Some of you may have seen me during those years, she continued. Maybe you walked past me in front of the library or near the hospital. I was still reading medical journals, following new research. Because even at my lowest, I couldn't stop being a doctor. It was never just my job, it was who I am. Robert saw several people in the audience wipe away tears. He felt his own eyes growing damp. Tomorrow, Angela announced, thanks to the support of many people, including my husband Robert. She gave him a warm look that made his heart skip. I'll be returning to Boston General. Not just as a surgeon, but as someone who understands what it means to fall and rise again. The applause was deafening. Robert watched as doctors rushed to welcome her back, making plans for her return. His social media followers would be getting quite a different story than the one he planned. Later that evening, in a quiet corner of the gala, the hospital director pulled Robert aside. You know, when we first heard about your marriage, we thought it was some kind of publicity stunt. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Well, actually. But now I see what it really was, the director continued, smiling warmly. A miracle. You helped bring one of our finest surgeons back to us. Back to the patients who need her brilliant mind and skilled hands. Robert opened his mouth to confess, but stopped when he saw Angela across the room. She was showing a young resident something on a medical tablet. Her face lit up with passion as she explained a complex procedure. This was who she truly was, not a social media story, not a publicity stunt, but a healer. A lifesaver. Sometimes, Angela said, joining them, we find our way back to ourselves through the most unexpected paths. She slipped her hand into Robert's. Even if those paths start as something else entirely. Robert squeezed her hand, realizing that his perfect publicity stunt hadn't just changed her life, it had changed his too. The man who had offered a cruel marriage contract was disappearing, replaced by someone who was starting to understand what really mattered. As they drove home that night, he finally asked the question that had been on his mind. The contract, was it all just a means to an end for you? Angela's answer would change everything, but that was a conversation for another moment. The morning of Angela's first day back at the hospital, Robert found himself doing something he'd never done before, making breakfast for someone else. He'd gotten up early, watched a quick online video about how to make an omelet, and was determined not to burn it. What's all this? Angela asked, walking into the kitchen in her new scrubs, her doctor's coat draped over her arm. Just thought you might need a good breakfast for your first day back, he said, trying to flip the omelet and only partially failing. Though I'm warning you, it might be safer to get something from the hospital cafeteria. Angela laughed, a real warm laugh that made the kitchen feel brighter. You've changed, Robert Chen, she said, sitting down at the counter. Yeah, well, he plated the slightly messy omelette. Turns out I had a pretty good teacher these past few months. As they ate breakfast together, Robert thought about how different his life had become. His social media accounts, once filled with flashy displays of wealth and staged moments, now showed genuine experiences. His followers had actually increased since he'd started sharing honest stories about learning and growth. Later that morning, Robert walked through the hospital corridors beside Angela, carrying a box of her medical books that they'd retrieved from storage. He watched as she greeted old colleagues, her confidence growing with each step. Dr. Peterson. A nurse rushed up, beaming. Room 302. We have a complex case. Would you mind taking a look? Robert saw Angela transform before his eyes. She handed him her coat, pulled her hair back, and switched instantly into doctor mode. "Tell me about the patient," she said, following the nurse. He stood there holding her coat, feeling strangely proud. This was who she really was, not his charity case, not his social media project, but a brilliant doctor who saved lives. In the following weeks, Robert found himself spending more time at the hospital. He started talking to patients' families in the waiting room, hearing their stories. One day, he overheard an elderly man worrying about paying his grandson's medical bills. That night at dinner, Robert was unusually quiet. "What's on your mind?" Angela asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "All these years, I've been building luxury properties, trying to make more money. But today I met a grandfather who's selling his house to pay for his grandson's surgery." Angela put down her fork, listening. "What if," Robert continued, "what if I used some of my properties differently? What if we created affordable housing for medical patients and their families, places they could stay during long-term treatments?" Robert Chen, proposing a project that's not about profit. Angela smiled. "Now that's a transformation." He shrugged, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Well, I had a good example of what really matters. Some brilliant doctor showed me that success isn't just about money." "Careful," Angela teased. "You're starting to sound like one of those inspirational social media posts you use to make fun of." They laughed together, but Robert was serious about his idea. The next day, he started looking at his property portfolio with new eyes. Buildings that he'd planned to turn into luxury condos could become something more meaningful. His wealthy friends thought he was crazy. "You're going soft," Frank told him over golf. "First you actually fall for your publicity stunt wife, now you want to give away prime real estate." But Robert didn't care anymore what they thought. He'd seen too much, learned too much. The man who had once offered a cruel marriage contract to a homeless woman was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand what real value meant. That evening, as he watched Angela reviewing patient files at their dining room table, he realized something else had changed too. Their contract marriage had less than 2 months left, and the thought of it ending made his heart ache in a way he'd never expected. 1 month before their contract was set to expire, Robert found Angela sitting on the penthouse balcony late at night, looking at an old photograph. He recognized her husband, David's face, smiling back from happier times. "I never asked you," Robert said softly, sitting down beside her. "Why did you really agree to this arrangement? You're brilliant enough to have found another way back." Angela was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights below. "When you offered me that contract," she finally said, "I'd been homeless for 2 years, 4 months, and 12 days. I kept count, you know. Every morning I'd wake up and think, today I'll find the strength to go back." She tucked the photo away. "But I never did." "What changed?" "You did." She turned to look at him. "Your offer was cruel, meant to mock people like me. But it was also a push I needed. Sometimes the worst intentions can lead to the best outcomes." Robert winced at her description of his past self. "I was horrible, wasn't I?" "You were lost in your own way," Angela said. "Just like I was. The difference is, you had money to hide behind." She smiled slightly. "Money that, ironically, helped me find my way back." "But you never planned to keep it, did you? The 100,000. Angela shook her head. "I'm donating it to the homeless shelter near the hospital. They need it more than I do now." She paused. "That's something else you taught me, actually." "Me?" Robert asked, surprised. "What did I teach you?" "That people can change. When I first met you, you were this arrogant billionaire playing with people's lives for social media fame. Now look at you, creating housing for patients' families, sitting with people in hospital waiting rooms, making terrible omelets just to be kind." They both laughed at that. but Robert felt something catch in his throat. "The contract ends in 4 weeks," he said quietly. "It does." Angela stood up, walking to the balcony rail. "You know, when I was living on the streets, I used to look up at buildings like this and think about all the lives inside them. All the stories. I never imagined I'd be part of one." Robert joined her at the rail. What if this story didn't have to end with the contract? Angela turned to him, her expression serious. "Robert, if you're saying what I think you're saying—" "I'm not the same person who offered you that contract," he said quickly. "And you're not the same person who accepted it. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we both needed to change to become people who could actually—" "Actually what?" "Actually love each other," he finished softly. The city hummed below them, 1,000 lives going about their evening, while up on the balcony, two people who had started as strangers in a cruel arrangement looked at each other with new eyes. "I have conditions," Angela said finally, a small smile playing at her lips. "Real ones this time." "Name them." "First, no more social media stunts. Ever." She held up her hand, counting on her fingers. "Second, you keep working on those patient family housing projects, not for publicity, but because it's right. Third," she took a deep breath. "Third, you have to understand that I'm not just your wife or just a doctor. I'm someone who lived on the streets, and I'll never stop advocating for the people still there." Robert reached for her hand. "I wouldn't want you to stop. Those people changed me too, through you." "One more thing," Angela added. "You have to let me teach you how to properly make an omelet. Watching you destroy eggs every morning is breaking my heart." Robert laughed, pulling her close. Above them, the stars sparkled over the city where their story had begun. A story that was about to turn into something neither of them had expected. 1 year later, Robert stood at a podium in front of a brand new building. Camera flashes sparkled in the morning sun, but this time, they weren't there for a publicity stunt. Beside him, Angela squeezed his hand as he began to speak. "Welcome to the New Hope Medical Housing Center," he announced to the crowd. "1 year ago, I thought I knew everything about success. I measured it in dollars, followers, and magazine covers." He paused, looking at his wife. "Then I met someone who taught me what real success looks like." The building behind them gleamed. 6 stories of comfortable apartments designed specifically for patients' families during long-term medical treatments. The rent? Whatever they could afford to pay. "When my husband first told me about this project," Angela stepped up to the microphone, "I knew he'd finally understood what I'd been trying to tell them. That everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their circumstances." She smiled at the crowd. "Today, we're opening not just this building, but a new chapter in both our lives." After the ceremony, they walked through the building together. Each apartment was furnished with care, not luxury, but comfort. The common areas included study spaces for children to keep up with schoolwork while their family members received treatment. There was even a small medical library, Angela's personal touch. "Remember when you thought marrying a homeless woman would make you famous on social media?" Angela teased as they rode the elevator to the top floor. "Well, it did," Robert replied, pulling out his phone. "Just not in the way I expected." He showed her his latest post, a simple photo of the building's first resident family receiving their keys. The comments were filled with hope and support, not the shallow praise he used to chase. They reached the top floor, where a surprise waited. Robert led Angela to a door marked Community Center. Inside, a group of doctors, including several of her colleagues from Boston General, were setting up medical equipment. "What's this?" Angela asked, looking around in confusion. "Your idea, remember," Robert grinned. "A free weekly clinic for people experiencing homelessness, staffed by volunteer doctors who understand that everyone deserves care, no matter their address." Angela walked through the space, touching the new examination tables, looking at the fully stocked supply cabinets. "You did all this." We did this, he corrected her. Your medical knowledge, my resources. Plus, he added with a smile, I had to do something impressive for our first wedding anniversary. Their real wedding had been nothing like the first one. No media circus, no publicity. Just two people who had found love in the most unexpected place, surrounded by the people who mattered. Hospital staff, recovered patients, and yes, several former homeless individuals who Angela had helped get back on their feet. As they stood looking out the clinic's window at the city below, Angela spotted the building where she'd once slept in the doorway. Life's funny, isn't it? She mused. That doorway led me right where I needed to go. Speaking of leading places, Robert said, suddenly looking nervous. There's one more surprise. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a property deed for a new homeless shelter being built near the hospital. I thought maybe, he said quietly, you'd like to help design it. Make it the kind of place that really helps people rebuild their lives. Angela looked at her husband, really looked at him. The arrogant billionaire who had once offered her a cruel contract was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned that true wealth wasn't about money at all. You know what the best part is? She said, pulling him close. This story isn't ending. It's just beginning. As they stood together in their new clinic, surrounded by the promise of help and healing, they both knew she was right. Their story had started as a joke, turned into a journey, and become something neither of them had expected. A testament to the fact that love, understanding, and second chances could change not just two lives, but countless others.